Hi, everybody. Wonderful to be back with you. And Yasher Koach to Rabbi Chapper and all the team at Borum Board and Elstree, who put together this great opportunity for us to spend a few minutes talking about issues of Pesach to prepare us for the Haggadah and to prepare us for the week of Pesach. In the time that we've got, I'd like to try and communicate a really fundamental idea, which hopefully we'll all be able to put across in our own individual ways to the people around us at the Seder. One of the key definitions of the Jewish community is that it's not a horizontal community only, not just the Jews alive today in our world, but all the ancestors that went before us and all the descendants that will come afterwards. All of us together represent the Jewish community. This is an explicit idea in the Torah when Moshe addresses the people at the beginning of Dvarim and talks about the fact that he's talking not just to the people who are here, but to the people who are not here, but who will be here. And therefore, connecting those generations vertically is one of the things that we're really going to focus on in terms of Pesach. I'd like to share a screen with you and go through a couple of important sources. Hopefully, you should be able to see the screen now. We'll come back out of this from time to time. But I want to look with you at the verse in the Torah that defines the mitzvah of the Haggadah. Let's look together at this in number one. You will Haggadah, tell over a story. Hagid means to tell over a story to your child on that day. And you will say, because of this, Asa Hashem li, God did for me, but say, Sima Mitzrayim, when I left Egypt. Now you see two very important things in that verse alone. Number one, that it's meant to be a communication from one generation to another, from parents to children, from grandparents to grandchildren. Later on in Devarim, it talks about the importance of grandparents and grandchildren communicating with each other. And critically, it's in the first person. It's not, this is what God did for them when they lived in Egypt, but this is what God did for me when I was in Egypt. And in that sense, the Torah is telling us immediately that what we have to do at Seder is somehow make this incredibly relevant to ourselves, to the people around us, even though we're living thousands of years after the events themselves. Maybe we can just look for a second at number 4. I'm going to send this to Rabbi Chapper, and I'll actually, put this on the chat if I can at the end, so that you can have it. But the verses that form the key unit of the discussion of the Haggadah, which are verses taken from the mitzvah of Bikurim, which is the first fruits, is an interesting choice. Because why doesn't the Haggadah in its central story pick from the verses in Exodus, pick from the actual account of Yetziat Mitzrayim? It doesn't do that. It goes to this mitzvah of Bikurim and Dvarim, where a farmer, thousands of years later, after the events, comes up to the temple with his first fruits. And if you just pick it up in the middle here where it says Higadati Hayom, says, I want to relate a story. Higadati, this is the word Haggadah, which connects us with the mitzvah of Haggadah. And this is the story. And he goes on and he says, Va'anitza va'amarta, the person will declare and will say, Lifnei Hashem Elokecha, before God, Arami Oved Avi. My father was a wandering Aramean, or an Aramean tried to destroy my father, different ways of explaining it. Vayereb Mitzrayim, he came down to Mitzrayim. Vayagarsham b'mitzay ma'at, v'hisham legoy gadol asomorav, became a great nation. Vayireu otanu ha'mitzrayim, the Egyptians afflicted us. V'ya'anunu, we cried out. Vayitnu aleinu, and they afflicted us. Okay, v'yitnu aleinu avoda kasha, and they put on us hard work. V'nitzak el Hashem, and we cried out to God. Elokei avotenu, vayishma Hashem et kolenu, God heard our voice. V'yaret anenu, and saw our affliction, and malenu, our toil, v'slachatzeinu, and our pressure. V'yotzienu Hashem Mitzrayim, God took us out of Egypt. V'yad chazakah b'zro netzuya, u'b'moreh gadol v'atotum oftim. Again, what's going on in that source is that the Torah is putting into the mouth of the farmer that even though he lived many centuries after the events themselves, he feels as though he was in Egypt. God took us out. This is what happened to me. We cried out, not they cried out. And as Rabbi Sachs puts it, this is not history. This is not his story. This is my story. This is our story. And the choice of those verses in Dvarim comes out of the verse itself in Shemot, which is, I have to tell my children, my friends, myself, what God did for me when I was in Egypt. So the idea of making it relevant is absolutely core and central to the Haggadah. Look at number 2 for a second. Here we have the Mishnah that sets out how to do the Haggadah. So if you look here, it says, Mazgula Kosheni, you pour out the second cup, which is the cup for Magid. Bekan haben shoel aviv. And here the child has to ask the father. There have to be a question and answer format. If the child doesn't know what to ask, the parent has to reach out to the child and teach the child and say some kind of an icebreaker, something to warm them up. Look how different this night is from every other night. And I extracted there all of the 4 questions that are in the Manishtana. And then the Mishnah ends, according to the abilities of the child, the parent has to teach them. Meaning, another key point here, that our Seder has to be on the right level for the people around us. It has to speak to them. It has to be geared towards them. It has to be, pedagogically worked out that I'm communicating these ideas in a way that people will respond to. There's no point giving a Seder geared up for an 18-year-old to a 7-year-old. And by the same token, there's no point giving a Seder for a 7-year-old to a teenager. People have to be met where they are, and it has to be relevant to them. And that's something we need to plan very carefully, but that comes directly out of this Mishnah. And then the Mishnah says, Matchil begnut masayim b'shevach. You have to start with the bad news, end with the good news. It has to have a progression here. And we have to explain these psukim that I just outlined for you in very brief terms in Dvarim. We have to put those across, the story of how we were in Egypt, etc. And that's the core central ideas of the Haggadah. Last source that we're going to look at for now, and then we'll develop these ideas. The Gemara, when it picks up on the Mishnah's outline of how to run a Seder, it says as follows. Source number 3. What does it mean, start with the bad news and end with the good news? My goodness, what is the transition from bad news to good news? What is the story? Says the Gemara, 2 opinions. Rav Amar mitchila ovdei avodah zara hayavosenu. Originally, we were pagans, we were idolaters, and now we have progressed to a position of being connected to a monotheistic understanding of God. That's one set of news. Shmuel Amar, and Shmuel says, Avadim hayinu. No, the bad news is that we used to be slaves and that we have become free. Why does the Gemara present these 2 stories? And this is where I want to bring out with you this idea that hopefully we can bring at our Sedarim. The Gemara presents that there are 2 kinds of story to tell. And you can decide, and we can decide which one we want to focus on. Some years, maybe we want to focus on one kind, with certain people, a different story. But there effectively are 2 stories of the Jewish people. One is a physical freedom story. This is a value for the whole world, that mankind should not be subjugated and oppressed by other human beings. There has to be freedom for people to be able to connect to God, to each other, to run their lives in the most fulfilled way possible. This is a universal value that we, the Jewish people, bring to the world through the Haggadah and through the Torah. Don't forget, the Jewish people in the Exodus are called Bechor, the firstborn of all the peoples in the world, meaning that we are all siblings. All human beings are part of the same family, but we, as the firstborn, have an obligation to spread these values to the world, that there is no ultimate ability to live our lives in a meaningful way without freedom itself. Now, of course, freedom is only part of the story. There's freedom from, we need to be released from the things, the meitzarim, the limitations from the word Mitzrayim, or they're from the same root, which are holding us back. But there's also freedom to, we have to be able to go to a place, which is why the Gemara gives us a second limb of the story. And this is why, of course, Pesach and Shavuot are effectively the same holiday. Shavuot is just the end point of Pesach, except instead of having a 7-day festival like Sukkot, where we have a festival at the end and one on the 8th day, with Pesach, there's more of a lead up. We have a festival at the beginning. We have 7 times 7 days of the kind of Chol HaMoed in between to get to the point of receiving the Torah and Shavuot, which is the freedom to, it's where we're heading to. And this is really an idea that I'd like to conclude with, that I think is very meaningful and maybe one of the ways to make Torah and the Haggadah meaningful to us. In the ancient world, and really still today, there are four worldviews as to what is the spiritual journey. One worldview, which the Rambam says is the view of Epicurus, which is where the Rabbi said apicorsis, the heretical worldview, is that there's no God, there's no creation, there's no intervention, there's no ultimate consequences, and therefore there's no meaning to life. Life is random and fundamentally meaningless, and we kind of bumble through it doing the best we can. That's one worldview. Another worldview is, you might call it the pagan worldview, is that there are powers out there are gods out there, but they're capricious, they quarrel, they intervene in a random way in the world. We are at their mercy, we have to just try and appease them. The world is random and therefore unjust because the gods themselves are unjust. Ultimately, there is no meaning to anything that is happening in our lives on a day-to-day basis. That is the pagan worldview. Then there is the Aristotelian worldview, which is, yes, there is one God, and one God underpins the whole of creation. There's not a pantheon of gods, but that God is so distant, so removed, so transcendent, that our prayers are ultimately meaningless in terms of connection with God. Our actions are ultimately meaningless. There's no intervention in the world. God does not intervene in human history, in Jewish history. There are no miracles in the world. This is a worldview which believes in God, but which is very removed from the reality of God. And then there's the Torah's worldview, which introduces a whole new perspective. And with this, I'd like to finish, and hopefully this will bring this to us in a way which is very relevant. The Torah says that God is not just the creator of the world. The Ten Commandments introduce God as the God of Yetziat Mitzrayim, the God who brought the Jewish people out of Egypt. Creation is very complicated. The rabbis talk about Ma'aseh Breshit, the Jewish perspective on creation, as one of the most complex ideas. It's not just about Adam and Eve and 6 days. It's much deeper than that, and that's what the rabbis have been telling us for millennia. It's maybe happens over billions of years. It happens through an evolutionary process. It happens through ideas in physics that are way beyond most of us. Therefore, creation is real, but less accessible to us. However, the intervention of God in history, Yetziat Mitzrayim, is absolutely critical. The Haggadah and the Exodus tells us of a God who is directly involved in our lives, who hears and is concerned for our reality, who intervenes in Jewish history in a way that, honestly, for most centuries, the Jews could not see. But in our lives, we are incredibly fortunate to see the intervention of what seems to many of us to be a divine hand over the last 100 years in so many aspects of world history and Jewish history. This is a worldview where every action that we take is meaningful. Every development that we bring to the world has consequences, that our prayers have importance, that God communicates with us in complex and subtle ways through text, through revelation in all its complexity, but that there is a reality to do that. So ultimately, the message of Yetziat Mitzrayim, the good news coming from the bad news, is twofold. It's that we insist as Jews on a world of human freedom, where people are released from the oppression of societies where might is right. That's fundamental number one. And number two, we insist that we live in a world of meaning, not of randomness, not of pagan capriciousness, not of an Aristotelian God who is so removed that it's effectively irrelevant, but in a world where life has meaning, our lives have meaning, every day has meaning, maybe even action has meaning, which is why halakha is concerned with even the micro actions that we take. Communicating this is relevant to our children, to our grandchildren, and indeed to our grandchildren's grandchildren. And therefore, we need to do what we can on this wonderful opportunity of Pesach to bring these realities to our lives, to our Sidorim, and they're as relevant in 2023 as they will be in 2523, and as they were millennia ago when the Jews came out of Egypt. I wish everybody a wonderful Pesach, a Pesach of meaning, of inspiration, and hope to be with you at some point, not just on Zoom, but in person as well. Chag Sameach.
Hi, my name is Siobhan Dansky, and I'm a graduate of the Chief Rabbi's Ma'ayam program. In the Haggadah that we read on Seder night, we come across 4 children who each have a different question about Pesach, and they each have a very different attitude towards Judaism. We have a wise son, a wicked, a simple, and a child who doesn't know how to ask. And there are lots of ways that we can understand what these 4 children represent. It could be that they represent 4 different kinds of Jews who all have different attitudes towards their religion. It could be that they're 4 generations, each one raised by the one before, and each one having a different relationship with their Judaism and attitude towards it based on the way they were raised. And it could also be that each one of these 4 are different relationships that we have with our Judaism at different times in our lives, depending on the circumstances and what's going on. There might be times that we feel really clued in and wise and we know what's going on. There might be times that we feel quite angry or even rebellious towards our Judaism. It might be sometimes we see something and just say, "What's this? Explain it to me in simple terms." And it might be there's times that we don't have anything to say at all, either because we've come across something that we've never heard of before and we just don't know where to start, or because we're just not interested and we don't want to discuss it right now. But whichever way you understand it, I think it's important to say that all 4 of these personalities are all welcome at the Seder table, and all their questions are relevant and important, and we have an obligation to answer each one of them in an appropriate way. We don't tell people that we don't want to hear their questions just because we don't agree with them. We invite people to ask, we encourage them to ask, and we try to answer them in a way that's going to suit them best. So with that in mind, we don't have time to look at all 4 now, but I just want us to think about the wise son for a few minutes. And this is what it says in Haggadah. Chacham mahu amer, the wise son, what does he say? Ma ha'edot v'hachukim v'hamishpatim asher tzivah Hashem Elokeinu etchem. What are all these laws and more laws, 3 ways of saying mitzvot, that Hashem our God commands you? Va'afata emor lo, and this you should say to him, Kilchot haPesach. It's like the laws of the Pesach sacrifice. Ein maftirin achar haPesach afikoman. That after you eat the afikoman, you can't eat anything else. So what's he asking? What's his question saying? What's the answer telling him? And do the 2 even match? So let's think about his question. Ma ha'edot v'hachukim v'hamishpatim. What are all these 3 different kinds of mitzvot? Asher Hashem Elokeinu, Asher tzivah Hashem Elokeinu etchem. That Hashem our God has commanded you. So first of all, let's think of what he's saying. He's classifying the mitzvot in 3 different ways. Edot, chukim, and mishpatim, and they mean very different things. Edot are witness mitzvot. An aid is a witness you would call in a court of law to bear testimony to something that happened. And that's what these mitzvot do. They're mitzvot that we keep because they bear testimony to something that happened long ago, like Pesach itself. Eating matzah and having Seder night and going through the story, we do it because that's what happened back then. And Shabbat, we have Shabbat every week because on the 7th day of creation Hashem rested, and therefore so do we rest from our creative work. Let's skip Chukim for a minute. We'll come to Mishpatim. Mishpatim are social laws, societal laws that we need to keep society working properly, like not stealing or not killing, or the laws of damages, or the laws of marriage and divorce, or paying your workers on time, being honest in business. All of these things are required to keep society working. Chukim are mitzvot that we don't have a rational answer why we do them, other than because Hashem told us to. So the classic example in the Torah is the para aduma, the red cow, which was a special kind of cow that was brought as part of a whole process to purify a person who'd become spiritually contaminated by coming into contact with a dead body. That's quite a mouthful. A much more everyday example of a chok is kosher. Why can't I have a cheeseburger? Why can't we mix milk and meat? Is there a logical reason why? No, there isn't. We do it because Hashem told us to. And that's the reason why. So with these 3 examples, if I was going to divide up the commandments, I would do it a much easier way. He could have just said, Ma ha-mitzvot asher tzivah Hashem Elokeinu etchem. What are all these commandments? Or he could have divided them much more simply into 2 groups. He could have said the do's and the don'ts. Do keep Shabbat, don't kill. Or he could have divided the commandments into the way that the 10 commandments are divided. The first 5, ben adam lemakom, between me and Hashem, like not worshipping idols or keeping Shabbos. And the other 5 are ben adam lechavero, between me and other people, like not killing, not stealing, not being jealous. That's much easier. So in the way that he's questioned the whole situation. He's showing that he's a smart boy. He's got a good Jewish education under his belt. He's been to yeshiva. He knows a lot. He's showing that in the way he asks the question, that he's got complexity about his knowledge and practice of Judaism. And yet, his question ends by saying, what are these commandments that Hashem our God commanded you? Why doesn't he say us? Why doesn't he say me? What is his question showing? It's showing that he's having an existential crisis, that he's saying that for all I know about Judaism and for all that I practice my Judaism, it feels to me like there's a them and us. It feels to me like you're getting something out of your Judaism that I'm not getting out of mine. So tell me, all these commandments that I know about and I've learned about and I practice, what do they mean to you? Because I'm not feeling spiritually connected from everything I know and everything that I do. And how do we answer him? We tell him about the afikomen. What's the afikomen? At the beginning of the Seder, we take the middle matzah and we break it into two pieces. And the bigger piece is the afikomen. We hide it away, and sometimes the children go find it towards the end of the meal. And then at the end of the meal, we eat the afikomen. And we have to eat it by a certain time of night, and that's what it is. How does that answer his existential problem that he's not feeling connected to his Judaism through the mitzvot? I think we can answer this in a few different ways. First of all, we can say that when it comes to a relationship, the detail means so much. The detail of how we do things and the effort we put into everything shows how much we care about the person we're doing it for. When it comes to the afikomen, there's a lot of detail involved in that. How much we eat, when we eat it, by what time we have to eat it, that you can't eat afterwards. There's lots of details to it. And just like the Chacham, he understands there's a lot of details to the mitzvot. We're saying to him, you are connecting with Hashem and building your connection with him just by doing what you're doing. Because when you care about someone, you do what you know they want you to do in as much detail as possible. That demonstrates the love you have in the relationship. So even if you're not feeling spiritually connected, you are developing the relationship already with what you're doing, and you should be proud of that. Something else about the afikomen is eating is one of the most basic things that a living being can do. And Judaism, some of Judaism, is about doing things in order to propel our spiritual connection. That through the performance of the commandments, through the prayers that we say every day, we can feel more spiritually connected. But the ultimate aim of Judaism is not just to be on a spiritual high. We're not a religion about just meditating and connecting in that way. What Judaism is also about is about taking spiritual ideas and bringing them into the physical world in very physical ways. And it doesn't get much more physical than eating. So we're taking the idea of Yetziat Mitzrayim, of coming out of Egypt, of that freedom and the slavery that's all wrapped up in the matzah itself, and we're making it into a physical act. So we're saying to the Chacham, it's not all about doing the mitzvot to feel connected afterwards, but sometimes it's about taking the spirituality and bringing it into your everyday activities in a Jewish way, and you're already doing that as well. But the last thing about the afikomen is that it's the last thing we eat at the meal, and we're not allowed to eat anything afterwards. We say that to him, Ein maftirin achar haPesach afikomen, which means that when you eat something and you don't cleanse your palate afterwards, that flavor lingers with you. And the longer you can still taste it in your mouth, the longer you're still thinking about it. And when it comes to the mitzvot, we're not a religion which is about instant gratification. I've done the mitzvah, where's my reward? I prayed, where's my connection? It takes time. We need to digest physically and metaphorically. We need to sometimes let these things sit with us for a while. So we tell him the answer to your problem is in the afikomen. That as much as you have to do the mitzvah and eat the afikomen physically, you also need to let it sit with you. And you need to ruminate, and you need to think, and you need to let it go into your soul over time. It's not going to happen instantly. Give it a chance. Let it linger. Let it stay with you, just like the taste of the afikomen. So with that, I wish you all a Chag Kasher v'Sameach.